Ole, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on the podcast.
I read your book on a recent flight to Los Angeles.
Wow.
Your book about poker. And I actually played poker when I was there because there are casinos out there.
Wow.
So I want to talk about my poker experience at the end of it because I had a very interesting realization.
Yeah.
But let's just start from the beginning. So why did you write a book about poker? You're a professor in a business school. Tell us a little bit about the philosophical framework that you study and why you thought poker was an interesting entryway into studying capitalism.
Well, first of all, I wrote the book because I like poker. I'm not a very good poker player, but I can certainly appreciate the charm and the excitement of the game. So that was one thing. And I had previously studied compulsive gambling, and a lot of the stuff that was written about gambling in that field is written by people who don't really care about gambling. So I wanted to write a book about gambling that actually appreciated the game. So that was the one part. The other thing was that as I was getting into poker, I was also reading some, like strategy books on poker. It kind of struck me that there was a similarity between poker and what I was kind of seeing in the financial world. So this was around, I think I started sort of around just around when the financial crisis was unfolding. So I kind of figured I have to sort of find out what's the relationship between these two things. What's the relationship between contemporary financial capitalism and poker on the other hand? So I guess my reading of poker in a way is I wanted to read poker as a cultural expression of capitalism, much in the same way that you would look at a piece of art or a novel or something else.
So I think at first blush, maybe people would say, oh, this doesn't really sound that unusual. It's fairly common cliche to say that the markets have become a casino and it's all gambling. But I think you push it further than that sort of surface level comparison. Explain the sort of philosophical framework that you're interested in, and then also specifically the sort of distinction, distinction you make between the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary, and how it relates to both.
One of the things that intrigues me about poker is how do you assess the value of a hand at a particular point in time in the game. And once you start unpacking that, you realize that it's actually an extremely complicated procedure. It's very difficult to just look at the hand and its intrinsic value and then from there say, so this is what the hand is worth. Because it comes to, the value of the hand is dependent on a lot of other factors. So how's your position in the game? Who are the other players? How did they play? What kind of types of players are they? And so forth. So I was kind of intrigued in the way that how do we put a price on the value of a poker hand in a way, and that's also what's going on in financial markets, is a game or an attempt to try and price or put a price on different types of values. So that's kind of what I was looking at. And then you introduced, or you mentioned Zizek, who's sort of the main philosophical character in the book, and he has this distinction between the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary. So he says the real is something that we cannot directly reach, or at least we can only capture it in terms of the symbols we put on it. And we can compare that to the way we talk about value. We can't really talk about value as such. We need to put a price on it before we can talk about it. But once we started pricing something, we've already moved from the realm of the real into the realm of the symbolic.
Wait, I'm lost.
Yeah.
Hold on.
Let's go back.
You're lost?
Hold on. So are we saying that there's no real value to something? Certainly not in poker. If you have a hand, it kind of depends on the hands of the other players and like their reaction to you. And it only becomes like actualized once you put a price on it. Is that what you're saying?
Well, what I'm saying is that sometimes the real matters and sometimes it doesn't. And we don't know, or it's very difficult to decide when it's one and when it's the other. That's the whole that's what keeps poker going, but that's also what keeps a market going. So if everyone in a market could agree on the price of a particular asset, there would be no trading, because there was no reason. There would be no reason. So trading comes about because people disagree on the true symbolization, if you like, or the true pricing of a particular asset. And now, I don't know, I kind of want to move into this thing about derivatives, if that's okay. Yeah. Because that kind of exemplifies how this works. So if we looked at what was happening going into the financial crisis in 2007, there was a lot of derivatives trading. We've heard about the collateralized debt obligations and other types of derivatives. And when we look back at it, we can sort of say, well, that was completely disconnected. The pricing of these was completely disconnected from any underlying reality in a way, and yet people kept trading them, and they kept making money. And I would even imagine that some of the people who were trading them, they knew very well that there were no underliers, or the underlier were not worth very much, and yet they kept trading because they could still make money. And then at some point, which no one could really predict, there was this what Zizek would call like an answer from the real. It was like sort of the real sort of intervened into the market.
Like a Minsky moment where everyone suddenly sort of like woke up and realized that actually these weren't being priced correctly. Yeah,
exactly. And the same thing is what goes on in poker. Many hands in poker are concluded even without anyone showing their cards. So most of what goes on in poker is, I mean, purely in the realm of the symbolic, if you like. But then all of a sudden, someone says, I think you're bluffing. I want to see your hand. And then you go to showdown, and then you show the hand, and then you see who wins. But you can't really predict if it's going to go to a showdown or if the other person is just going to fold, and then the hand is completed without anyone showing their cards. So in a sense, you could also say, if you want to use the word or the concept of Minsky moment, poker is a game that sort of circulates, or it plays around with Minsky moments, so to speak.
One of the things that I really liked in the book was this idea. So, like, you know, it's sort of well understood that we live in a symbolic world from the moment that we learn words and learn to read and learn to speak. We associate symbols with everything in everyday life, and so symbols permanently intermediate our understanding with reality. But that one of the appeals of gambling is essentially to have the opportunity, I think, if I'm understanding what you've said correctly, to essentially get to experience the real unmediated by the symbolic. So sometimes you might pull a slot on a slot machine, and even though the odds are really stacked against you, you win big. And so essentially you've violated what the symbolic says. The symbolic says you should lose when you pull the lever, but every once in a while you win. You get to break through this sort of symbolic structure that sort of defines everyday life.
Yeah, so you can say that probability theory it's kind of a symbolic order or a symbolic law, if you like. And what we try to do with probability theory is to tame chance in a way. We can say we know this is random, yet we can calculate these probabilities, and we can master it by doing this. And that's essentially also what you do with. You can also find that in markets very much. The thing is, however, that probability theory works only in the long run. It never works in the single instant. So when you do win against all odds, you have this experience that not only have you won sort of a particular amount of money, but you've beaten the law in a way. And there's a certain sense of thrill in that. It can also be horrifying in a way, but there's an element of thrill in that. And that's another thing that I think that games, and poker in particular, kind of thrives on, is this element of being able to, or having this sense of defeating the law. I think you can find the same thing in trading. I think a lot of traders also can have this sense of, oh, now I kind of kind of beat the system or something like that.
Yeah, one thing that I find to be very interesting about trading, and this is also similar to poker, is that, if you look at someone who's a beginner in the markets, maybe they'll buy a handful of stocks and try to beat the market, and they're almost guaranteed to lose money. And then you get this sort of next level investor who I think you might characterize in poker as a grinder, who buys index funds and ETFs and hardly trades because they know intellectually that that's the smartest way. But then you get to an even higher level of trader, like someone like a George Soros or like some brilliant hedge fund manager, who at any discrete moment, their portfolio might look identical to a novice trader because they're and it's very similar to poker, where in any discrete hand or even a tournament, it can be difficult to distinguish a terrible poker player from a great player.
Yeah, so as part of the book, I did some research among poker players, and I discovered that they also had all these terms that they would use to characterize different players or types of players. And so I used sort of these ideal types of the sucker, the grinder, and the player to sort of categorize different players. And then I combine this with this distinction between the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary. So the sucker is someone what turns the sucker on is exactly what we talked about before, taking wild chances and then winning against all odds. The grinder, we find he masters sort of the symbolic, so he's very much into probability theory, and what turns him on is the opposite. It's the ability sort of to control chance and to play in the long run and have a sort of steady in the long run. What the player, this third type, what he does, he masters the imaginary, and that's he can not only can he sort of read the other players, but he can also go into this game of reading how the other players read him, or reading how the other players read that he reads them, and goes back and forth. The players are kind of the one that has the highest level of mastery of the game. What they can also do is that they will play in a certain way for a period of time, and then all of a sudden they will shift gears and then throw everyone else in the game, throw them off, and then get a big win. And the player again is then turned on by something else than the other two figures. And I'm certain I think you can find the same among people who trade in financial markets.
Which of the three prototypes that you just laid out would you say dominate in financial markets?
None of them, because I think they're all there, and their simultaneous presence is what kind of characterizes. But I think all of them, I think if there were no suckers, then there wouldn't be any profits for any of the others.
I want to ask you about something specifically going on in the markets right now that really fascinates me and a lot of traders. We have in the U.S., there's this election coming up that is causing a lot of people a lot of anxiety. People are trying to figure out how to play the election, what kind of trades will do well if Trump wins or Clinton wins. How to take advantage of the fact that maybe everyone thinks Clinton will win and Trump is underpriced. One trade that really stands out that people are talking about is the Mexican peso, and there's a lot of trading in the peso related to the idea that because Trump has been so sort of antagonistic with his rhetoric towards Mexico, that the peso would get
You can
hit.
say it, Joe. He's going to build a wall.
He says he's going to build a wall. And so there's been this is one asset, and derivatives related to the peso are like clearly trading around the election. But it's not clear to me as an observer that there's anything real here in the sense that if Trump were to win, that would really be necessarily bad for the peso or the Mexican economy. And it feels like this is something where trading has moved from the realm of the real, as in the peso moving based on fundamentals of the Mexican economy, to simply people trading against each other because they imagine that other people are playing the same game, essentially. Do you see this when you look at markets where there's like a tipping point where some idea enters the realm? It's like, this is going to be how we trade this risk. And suddenly it no longer becomes based on the real, but essentially a game in and of itself.
Yeah, I think, particularly with Forex markets, it's very difficult to say, so what are actually the fundamentals that we're trading on here? I think if you look at the U.S. dollar, the U.S. economy or the U.S. government, they're building up this huge debt. And I think everyone knows that it's never going to be paid. And yet this doesn't seem to have any real effect on the price of the dollar. So I think in Forex market, it's very difficult to say what is the real. At the same time, I think that when we think about these interventions from the real, they can come in many different forms. And one of the forms in which they can come is actually when there's a when politics intervenes into economics in a way that sort of goes beyond what we could have imagined in a way. Like, one thing that one could foresee sometime in the future, I think it's going to be some years into the future, but I think we could conceive of a shift where the US dollars would stop being sort of the reserve currency of the world, because other superpowers are saying, it's costing us too much money, we don't want to do this anymore, we don't want to buy into this monetary hegemony anymore, so now we'll sort of try and disconnect from this idea. And in that case, you could have a huge shift. And when people then some years later look back at that, and then they would look at the way we're saying now and say, whoa, remember before 2020 or whenever the shift happens, it was the US dollars was trading completely out of any fundamentals, and then we had the correction in 2020 when other currencies became reserve currency. Anyway, so I guess my point here is to say that then it's in the nature of the real to be beyond something that we can truly anticipate or calculate.
We just have a few more minutes, but if you don't mind, I just wanted to tell a very short story about poker, because I mentioned that I was in California recently, and I had a few hours to spare. I was on a brief vacation with my wife.
Joe, does this end in you winning big?
No, it's just the opposite. Okay. So I had a few hours to spare. I love poker, and I had a few hours to spare.
Poker stories with wives in them don't usually end.
It's never a good sign.
End good.
But I had a few hours, and I went to a casino on the outside of LA, and I sat down, and not all that much money. But as much as I love poker, and I think it's a fascinating game, I started getting really depressed when I was there. It felt kind of lonely. It felt kind of pointless. I was like, what am I doing? I'm in this beautiful city. The weather is great. I'm indoors. And I couldn't stand up though. So I was losing money. My head wasn't in it. I wasn't playing well. And then near the end, I looked down at my cards and I had pocket kings. And I got all the money in pre-flop. I bet, and then someone raised me and I re-raised. We went all in, and he had pocket queens. But he caught a queen on the turn, and so he flopped a set, and he won all my money. And then as soon as that happened, I felt this overwhelming sense of relief. You'd think that would really upset me, but actually I found the cloud had lifted, and I was sort of unhooked from the game, and then I could just sort of walk out. I'd lost all my money. And it really, it's sort of what you were saying is the exhilaration of the real intervening into the symbolic. I should have won that hand. I think the odds are 12-1 when you have a pair over pair and all the money goes in, or something like that. But it didn't happen. And rather than being upset, it was this tremendous sense of relaxation and relief that descended over me. And I know in your book you talk about problem gambling, and it's so some of how the gambling manifests in real life. And I wanted to get your sort of a take. I wanted to get your psychological reading of what happened to me.
Well, I think one of the fascinating thing about poker is that you encounter all sorts of emotions in poker. I think I quote someone in the book saying, poker is about everything you can find in life except love, but there doesn't have to be love everywhere. Something like it. He put it a little bit smarter than I can do. So on the one hand, you can find extreme joy and exhilaration, but you can also find kind of depression in there. It's kind of all in there, and the difference between the two can be very sort of sudden, or the shift between the two can be very sudden. And I would say for my own, what I've realized is that I only like to play poker with people whom I would like to have a beer with anyway.
Right.
Yeah. So for me, it's I've also tried like playing games, obviously with strangers, and yes, it's been fun, but at the same time, it's like, yeah, I kind of have to like people in order to play with them. But of course, there is this. One of the things that the game does, it drags you in. That's also why you can end up becoming a compulsive gambler, because it has this force where it sort of drags you in. And even though many compulsive gamblers, when they do play, they don't feel very, very well. It's not like they're just, oh, I'm playing, this is great. No, they can sit there and be really depressed.
Even if they're winning?
Well, regardless of regardless of their win, whether they're winning or losing, doesn't necessarily matter. It can matter, but it doesn't necessarily. But they will kind of still be sitting there, which for me is also, it's a fascinating thing about gambling and poker, but it's also, of course, a scary thing. I mean, that's also one of the things that got me into studying gambling in the first place, is that I was fascinated by the fact that with such simple means, basically what you have is that you have a stack of plastic discs and a stack of paper cards, yeah? And then yet you can, just by moving those things around, you can sort of have people feeling the most extreme emotions just by that very, very simple technology. And I was just like, wow, that's amazing. So I don't want to say that I've sort of cracked the code on that, but that was kind of what I wanted to get at in my studies.
Well, Ole, I think that is a great place to leave it. It's a fascinating book. I'm also looking forward to reading your follow-up books, and really appreciate you coming on the podcast today.
I was very happy to be on the podcast. Thank you very much to both of you.